Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Catching Up with Web Performance, a podcast about stories of people in web performance. Today, my special guest is Vinicius Dallacqua. Vinicius, man, how's it going?
Hello and hello everybody. Yeah, it's going good. It's going great. It's good to be here.
I'm glad to have you. We talked a little bit already, but the gist of the show is I want to hear stories, man. I want to talk about like how you got into this, how you learned, things you find interesting, difficult, confusing, and then just see where the conversation goes from there. So, what's your first web performance memory? Like, how did you get started in all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am originally from Brazil. I'm a Brazilian living in Stockholm, working for Spotify now for about 3 years. And it all began, I'm from a part of in Brazil that it does not necessarily belong to the great big centers where most people come from. So I come from an area where resources, let's say, were a bit more scarce. So internet speeds were quite not there. So as I was in the university and building systems, like learning how to build systems, they mostly taught us backend stuff. So they did not really teach us a lot of front end things. But I kind of, from very early on, had a passion for user experience in general. And that kind of ended up evolving towards performance, where I really wanted to make sure that whatever I built would be fast, or at least fast enough on such internet speeds that I was facing back in the day. So that kind of stuck with me from since.
Were you building things already? Like, do you remember some of the early things that you were doing?
Yeah, I mean, I was building. So back in the days, I worked for a government agency that was responsible for the elections. Well, still is responsible for the elections. And within it, one of our, of course, like in Brazil, the elections are fully digital. So like they have like a digital process and everything is electronic, which is awesome because like you have results within hours and all that good stuff. But it absolutely must not fail. And the team I was with, we built systems both to actually execute that process, but also that supports the process around it. So internal systems and externally facing systems that gets no access for 3 years, and for like 2 days after every 2 years or 2 to 3 years, it is absolutely battered. So it also mattered back then, performance since then. So yeah, I was working there for like 6 years, and before I decided to move out of Brazil.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking of, here we go. Everything's fine. And then the 2 years are up and it's time for the election. And you mentioned it's completely battered. Like, how do you prepare for that? What were some of the things? Can you remember, like, what was it like? What did it feel like in that moment?
Yeah, it's definitely a very stressful time for everyone involved because the systems cannot fail. Like, you do have like contingency plans, and as any good system would have, right? Like, so you scale accordingly and you have contingency plans and whatnot. But I mean, back in the days, we just like stress test it, and you have like some audits run on it because it also must be secure and must be private, right? Like, so all of that stuff, like your vote is private, it can't be breached. That's privacy can't be breached. So like, there is a very rigorous process actually around it. So it taught me a lot back then.
Yeah. And then from there, did you move to, you said to Stockholm, like right after that, or like what happened next?
Yes. So from there, I actually moved to Malta.
Okay.
I lived 3 years in Malta in the Mediterranean and working for a Swedish company, a small Swedish company. But then every time I came to Sweden, I really was like, okay, I'm sold on this country. I want to stay in Sweden. And after 3 years, I decided to move out of Malta and settle in Sweden. I've been here for about 6 years now.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, curious, like, hey, like what inspired you to go from place to place? Was this, a job leading you or life?
There was always a job. Yeah, it was always a career progression in a way. I mean, of course, tied to the personal side where I really wanted to move to Sweden.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But it was always a job choice. So I worked my way up to Klarna, which is fintech, a Swedish fintech, currently even expanding to US as well. But it's big in Europe. And we had, there is one of the places where, again, I was flexing my performance brain, where for Klarna, they have, I mean, it's checkout, right? So it's of course more complicated than that. But the product that I was part of is the Klarna checkout experience, where merchants would embed us, them, into their websites to serve. Works very close to how you would use PayPal or like Shopify experience, but it's an embeddable solution, right?
Yeah.
So of course that can also, like, it cannot fail as a purchase experience, right? And it has to be performant. But most important of all, there is always Black Friday. So it had a very similar feeling.
The election of e-commerce.
Exactly. So it had a very similar feeling. It was a bit of a throwback for me.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, for big merchants, you have big volumes, but like people don't really shop that much around the year, right? There are always like some ups and downs. But when it comes to Black Friday, it's the most important day of the year. You cannot fail for everything that's sacred. So it was kind of the same, right? Like very important things like stress testing, making sure that performance it's not hindered, and code freezes and all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm curious, like these two wild examples of this just cannot fail. Like I have huge Black Friday sales and I have elections to deal with. I don't know anything about stress testing. What do you actually do when you stress test something?
So it depends. There are different, of course, like most systems are multi-layered, right? So you have your back end and you have your front end. So for the front end to fail, it's a lot harder, right? Because most of the times you're just shipping assets. So as long as Amazon is up or Google is up, you're up, right? So your assets are already compiled and already built, which is where I worked most of the time for both options. Of course, back in my Brazilian software developer days, everything was a bit more coupled together. Mm-hmm. Just because it was 2012, it was another time, other ways of building things. HTML and jQuery was still very cool, so everything was a bit more coupled.
jQuery is still cool.
jQuery is still cool.
No.
So everything was built a bit more coupled, and through that, of course, stress testing meant for us to make sure that it could handle the predicted. The load is massive, but quite predictable in that case. So you can there's not much of uncertainty when it comes to scaling. But on the other hand, for Klarna, it is of course a lot more unpredictable. You don't know. You just know there's going to be loads of people trying to buy at the same time. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to front end, at least all you have to do is make sure that your front end has good performance, right? Which back then we did not have all the good tools that we have currently when I was there through some 3 years ago.
What do you have?
We're still starting. We did not have Web Vitals and none of that, but all the performance metrics like TTI and time to first byte and first contentful paint, all of that stuff was already starting. So we had something to point our fingers to, right? Okay, is our front end performant enough? Is it good enough? Because that's what really all that we had to make sure. On the back end, of course, there is same problems with scalability and stress testing and smoke testing. If we hammered this with hundreds of thousands of requests a second, would it be able to withstand that?
Yeah. Which again, me as a dummy, I'm picturing you clicking the website a bunch. Are you manually clicking 1,000 times or 300,000 times? Or are you making a robot?
No.
Or how do you?
You're running scripts and robots, to do that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the back end is this, I have a lot less experience from that, but I participated in some testing sessions.
And would you do something similar for the front end too?
For the front end, we would just make sure that mostly it would be just the auto scaling works if we need more buckets to serve. But mostly it's just making sure that the code is stable.
Gotcha.
and performant, right, when it comes to load times. And one of the things that really led me to dig even deeper into performance it was when Lighthouse came about, and we had the possibility of knowing beforehand
Yeah.
if you would be able to ship good performance code.
Could you know beforehand before Lighthouse, or was it like a revelation that, wow, Lighthouse, I can actually...
Yeah, no, it was really great. Beforehand, you would have to just have a profiling session, like you would have to I think this page is not performing well, and profile it and, go look into the flame charts.
Like in DevTools or something up in there where we're using Firebug back then, or just DevTools?
I did use Firebug fairly, but my one of my favorite tools were just to take a look at the flame charts and like the network graphs and see how things stack together.
Yeah.
But when Lighthouse came about, I was absolutely obsessed with automating Lighthouse performance profiling.
Mm-hmm.
And I did create, before we nowadays we have Lighthouse CI, which does exactly that. But back then we didn't.
Right.
And I kind of back then, before Lighthouse CI existed, I created sort of my own version of it. I'm sure many other people out there did the same. For the same reasons, and ended up creating an automation around Lighthouse to every time we have a code change coming up on GitHub, that would execute a script to run Lighthouse against the build for that PR and make sure that comparing against what we had in master, we would not introduce any sort of performance degradation. And with that, at least on the lab scenario, make sure that we were, predictable.
Right. Do you remember the moment that you first heard of Lighthouse? Were you looking at Twitter, or were you on a newsletter? And then the first time you tried it, maybe? Do you remember?
I think I can recall. It was definitely Paul Irish on Google I/O, I think, when he had a talk about Lighthouse. And back then it was a Chrome extension that you could download and install.
Yeah.
So I immediately did that. And it was such a pivoting point really for tooling when it comes to performance tooling. Yeah. And after that, I actually started using it as much as I could.
Yeah.
So it made the life so much easier.
Just click the button, let it run. All of a sudden I have nice. Was it still, the green, yellow, orange, or is that right? Green, yellow, red?
Yeah. Green, yellow, red.
Yep.
Yeah, and the best part is just the actionable items and so that you have from it, which helps people it helps people from all kinds of knowledge, right? You run an audit and it gives you actionable things to do that you can do to fix. Of course, as you come to understand, with most computer science problems you have it's always a big, it depends kind of some things are always more gray area than others, and you need a lot more experimentation around it. But for what it gives is really great value.
Yeah. So sorry for 1 second. I feel like I missed, what was the job in Malta? There was back in Brazil, which I'm going to get the name of the agency. What was the name of it?
So in Portuguese it's TRE, the initials.
TRE. So we're back in Brazil, TRE. Then go to Malta. We didn't quite talk about this one as much, but what was in Malta?
It was a front-end dev position on a small Swedish company there.
And then after that, going to, is it Klarna? Is that how you say it?
After that, I went to another smaller, slightly bigger Swedish company in Sweden. And then from there, just after 6 months, I got hooked by Klarna.
Mm-hmm. And then at Klarna, Black Friday, everything's wild, exciting. And then while you're there, Lighthouse comes out, changes the game. What happens after that? Because are you still at Klarna now, or you're not?
No. Okay. Now I'm at Spotify it's been 3 years here at Spotify. And it was kind of funny because when I started doing those automations with Lighthouse at Klarna, I was really hooked into it. I was like, okay, this is kind of where I want to, become a specialist. I want to do this tooling for performance and performance processes and performance oriented work. And when I started interviewing for Spotify, I actually on the managerial talks that we have during the process, I was always I really want to work with performance. Wherever you put me within Spotify, let me do performance. It's my thing, it's my jam. I really love doing it and talking about it and writing about it. So if there is not a performance culture, I will create it.
Was there one? Did you make one? Where are we now?
And this is now the third part of my career, which kind of it turns into something on how do you create a performance culture around the company, right? Because I started doing that at Klarna, where I created tooling around it and helped other teams to utilize such tooling to help them as well build a better performance awareness and doing talks internally and creating articles. And when it came to Spotify, there was there was people interested, but nothing really was properly spawned out of it. So I kind of started over with the same project. Actually, I ended up, but this time around with Lighthouse CI.
Yeah.
So I started over like, okay, let's automate Lighthouse tooling with our builds and understand our performance on lab and make sure we don't ship regressions for performance, right? That's step 0. And from there, I just like building internal knowledge and the culture, and like we have to care about performance.
Is it just you? Are you the Lone Ranger, like creating this culture? Or?
Well, I'm one of. There are more passionate, a lot other passionate people that are around. That also likes about like teams that really help enabled me working. We have a fantastic web infra team based in New York, where I had the pleasure to embed with and create the standardize the tool that I started creating to become like a plug and play solution for anyone within the web domain to have Lighthouse tooling. And from that, now I'm working mostly with also now solving the problems for real user monitoring, which is the other side, right? Like you can't only look at lab, you have to look at your users' data to better understand your product.
Yeah. So just to make sure I've got the Spotify story, you're interviewing, talking to the managers, put me in coach, put me in performance. Like I just need anything. And they say, okay. And there was or was not, it sounds like you got there and you found a couple people. You weren't the only one. There were some other people there you found to rally around this idea.
Yeah, there was a few people that was already like doing some things around, but nothing was taking much shape. And so what I did from beginning was to announce really like, look, I really care about performance, guys. And then every time there was something that I was doing to make sure it was, there was knowledge around it, right? Like, so me and my manager was constantly talking, of course, and making sure that the other managers also understood that there was work being done. And then I actually created our first performance-oriented event within the company. I dubbed it Perf Days.
Nice.
I'm actually planning a second one for this year.
Nice.
But on that day, I gathered all those like-minded people that wanted to talk about performance and gather everyone together and just share the culture, share the knowledge, and others that would be curious about it. And it was really awesome. It was a great success. And now we're going to have the second iteration soon. And it's that like really trying to like get everyone that was doing something or was curious about performance and to know that there is an effort going on to try to bring
they're not alone.
Ideas together. Exactly. So trying to be the voice of that. And that's kind of how I've been now on this part of, let's say, my quote unquote performance career so far is trying to solve this problem, right? Like, how do you create a culture around performance? How do you come to a company and like make that movement, like, how do you convince managers that is important? And like we can talk more about some of the understandings that I currently have.
Yeah.
Like how do you convince managers? How do you bring people together and build the knowledge and build the tooling? And like this is now where I'm currently focusing.
I would love that because, through this story, I mean, we've got a lot of these technical ideas, like how are we stress testing, preparing for these big days where performance really matters because we can't fail. And then it morphs somewhere along the way. You get this, whoa, I'm super passionate about this. I'm automating this tooling that equips and empowers people to measure performance for themselves and to create better things themselves. And then that spins off even more to, no, I want to create a culture around this. Like I don't just want me and some people being, okay, cool, we've got tools, but like also I want there to be a rallying cry. I want people to know they're not alone. I want people to know that they have somewhere to look for answers or advice.
Yeah, exactly. And like building the knowledge, building processes, and like, because things become a lot easier when like, and you can definitely like take a step back and think how how it was back then, right? Like when we did not have a collective agreement. It's not as far as standardization because it's not part of W3C just yet, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But before we had this collective agreement and understanding of which metrics are important. And now we have Core Web Vitals, a group of absolutely amazing people that gathers together and discuss metrics and try to come up with better metrics to help us, deliver the best results to our users, which is, the most important thing to me since the very early days. But back then we did not have such a thing. We were just like, the site is fast. It feels fast, and then we started talking about perceived performance, and then things started taking shape, right? Mm-hmm. But now we have an easy way of pointing out to things that matter, that we can measure and we can understand. So it becomes part of creating a developer culture, becomes also building that knowledge internally, right? Mm-hmm. Also having easily accessible information about that and about like, okay, if I'm trying to solve my performance problems, what are the steps I can take? Like to help people, bring people on the same level and together onto like, it's not a difficult task to do if you have information around it and if you have a culture that helps people around it, mm-hmm. right? Building the tooling and helping enabling those processes to become something part of your development process instead of just a second thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We got so many directions we could go here because like there's one side of culture trying to, it almost sounds like negotiating with your managers or like somehow convincing. There's a weird side of convincing here, making a case. And then on the other side, there's, I guess I'll call it equipping. Like we're talking to the other developers, the people implementing the changes. And then there's the tooling still in the background. Core Web Vitals comes out. Whoa. And now we have the W3Cs provided the performance API, and I can actually collect RUM data, right? Like there's kind of these three different topics, I guess. Which door should we open now? And maybe I'll phrase it this way. What things most interest you, or which things do you find difficult or confusing about web performance?
So the things that most interest me is still greatly about user experience, but nowadays, I guess it's kind of morphing into both my end users and about the developers that trying to solve performance issues.
UX and DX.
Exactly. So the two sides of the same coin. And if you manage to make both happy is great. So to me, kind of shifts a bit into that nowadays on the importance and the negotiation aspects with managers and all of that people becomes a lot easier a task when you have data in hands, right? Like when you can show them like, look, we are hurting our users. Look at the bounce rate versus our core web vital metrics. It's like try to build a connection and a correlation. And then that kind of becomes a much easier talk to have. But you first have to have data. And for that, you need to have the developer experience in check.
And have you had that talk? Have you had to like collect data and put it, I don't know, on a spreadsheet and say here? Or like maybe what's one of those times that you had to have a conversation like that?
I had to have similar conversations. Thankfully, people here at Spotify really cares, same as me, about the end user experience, right? Mm-hmm. And I have been blessed with project managers that cares about performance as much as I do. So my job has been made a lot easier. But when it comes to any kind of talks with managerial level people, you always need data. And for that, the whole DX and tooling becomes kind of a step zero for most people to start building stuff.
So tell me a little about that data. So now you mentioned real user monitoring too. Do you start with some lab tests and just say, hey, look how fast our website is? Or do you jump straight to, let me get some RUM data and show them correlations?
Yeah, it depends. It depends on where you are. It's definitely, I mean, for twice now, I have started with lab data. Mm-hmm. And the reasoning behind it is lab data, like especially with ours, you can create pretty convincing data, as in you can shape how the profiling is done and fine tune it to a certain degree to where you can be fairly confident on those results that comes after it. Of course, will never fully represent real users, but it can give you a very good indication of problem areas. So with the development side done, you at least can try and make sure that you're not shipping regressions on performance and understanding your current state, right? But the natural second step, and where you are actually going to start being able to come with data, is when you have real users' data. Then you will really be able to understand, okay, so like Spotify is a global product, right? Like the user experience is not the same for everyone. And I work with the web player of Spotify. So I work with the mobile web player most of the times nowadays, which is even on a narrower niche where we're focused on the emerging markets, right? Where performance really matters.
I have so many questions now.
Yeah, for sure. And from there, you start like, okay, for users in Brazil, again, like on a Motorola Moto G, on a 3G connection, patchy 3G connection, how is the user experience there?
Yeah.
And because you compare across a broad section of data, and you have to properly also slice it and make sense, right? Because you can't just put everyone in the same pot if you have a global product.
Interesting. Tell me more about that. Like I hear slicing and I think pies and pizzas. Like what you're slicing data? What do you do?
Yeah, so you're making sure that you segment the data to make as much as an accurate representation as you can. Because when you have a global product, people will use it in different conditions and different devices and different network conditions. And when even battery percentages matter, where cell phone can go into a low power consumption, where they use slower cores, which affect your JavaScript compiling time and all of that stuff, you really like as much data as you can gather on to those kind of things, like how the device battery is, if you have access to that kind of APIs, it really helps you understand. So when it comes to slicing the data afterwards, you want to make sure that, for instance, you don't compare users in the United States with a 5G connection are in the same pot as users in India or Brazil with the bad 3G connection. So you want to slice that data to have a proper...
So look at just a group of people, like I'll look at the data from the people in the US on their 5G connections.
Yes.
And I'll look at that in like one dashboard. And then I'll look at, emerging markets like new users in India on a different dashboard. Keep those separate.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Because those, like when you talk about percentiles, if you put them together, those become the 99, 95 percentiles, right? So we're talking about the tail end of your graph, right? Like that long tail that forms after your graph has peaked. Yeah. And then you're talking about like the people who are really struggling. Right. That section of users who really are struggling, the P99s, P95s, and so on. So if you're only taking medians and, we're getting too technical on how looking at the dashboard.
We're getting to statistics.
Hey, you thought you'd never use that stuff when you were in college, didn't you?
You were wrong.
Well. But yes, exactly. So if you only look at mediums, averages, and P75, yes, you're going to fix for a lot of people, but then you're not going to really understand the people who are really struggling with the current state.
Yeah. So I'm interested in what are things you've been learning with the Spotify mobile web player? Like, are there things that have surprised you that have come out of this?
Definitely. One is that how incredibly difficult it is to build a play button that works properly.
Really? Tell me more.
Oh, you would be surprised. But it's like the whole, like, you can't get very technical here.
The play button cannot fail.
Well, we cannot. But yeah, like how different, even to this day, when it comes to the desktop world, things are looking pretty good and standardized. We have most of the browsers now on Chromium, which is pretty much all the major browsers are now evergreen. So, like the struggles of the past definitely do not really affect people. That's not necessarily the same in mobile world, actually, because most people don't realize, but iOS users only use Safari, even when they are on different browsers.
What?
Yeah,
I've got Firefox on my iPhone right now, Vinicius. Are you telling me this is a lie?
It's a lie. So yeah, like at first time I heard that a few years ago, I was surprised.
Which, to clarify, we're saying that browsers, like all the browsers that you find on your iPhone, they may look like a different browser. And they have some things that are unique, but under the hood, they're all using WebKit. They're all using Apple's engine.
Exactly. They're all using WebKit and they're all using Apple's engine. So you are very limited when it comes to iOS development for the web, because it does not evolve as fast. It's not an evergreen product. It's still tied. It's like pretty old style of shipping browsers, right? It's very attached to your current operating system.
I'm going to shout out Jen Simmons. So I've seen the team on Twitter, like they've been pushing a lot of updates to Safari. So shout out.
Yes.
Thank you.
Shout out.
Thank you for doing some excellent work.
Yes.
Keep it up.
Yes. Keep doing the good work. You are the heroes.
Yeah.
But definitely, yes. It's hopefully they will manage to win over the product manager and show, again, talk about the two sides of the coin, the user experience, but also the developer experience, right?
Because there's still some APIs that we're looking for to get.
Absolutely. And there is the whole thing on, I mean, ultimately also like you can get very, very political and very technical on like how user choice matters as well when it comes to that. And, you know, progressing the web development and the web in general on a much less controlled and stricter way. And you can get very political and democratic and technical on that part.
Right.
But yeah, so like when it comes to developing for the mobile web,
not everybody has it.
Exactly. For developing for the mobile web, it becomes kind of back into the old days in a way, because even on the Android world, like iOS is pretty good at catching up with the newest versions, but Android not so much. And then you're still kind of like, you have some older versions of Chromium running on older versions of Android. So it's kind of still a lot of reminiscent of back in the old days when it comes to that browser support area and having to check things, and some APIs are not available and all that stuff. So it is a different way of building for the web, as most modern people that only builds for desktop or mostly for desktop would think about.
So tell me about this play button then. What is so hard about making a play button work on a mobile web player?
Well, for most developers who are not aware of the intricacies, it's not because of the technical challenges. Of course, we have great API for audio playback and all of this stuff. But when it comes to the legal aspects of the whole, of course, like you have, because, well, Spotify has encrypted audio, of course, right? And it has different licenses that you have to be aware of.
Wow. So if I open mobile web player on my Android phone, and I hit that play button, you're telling me it's going out and talking to a lawyer. It's checking all these different things to make sure that I'm allowed to play this song like within milliseconds before it begins playing.
In a way, yes. That kind of it's what happens.
That's wild, man.
Yeah, it's quite mind opening. There are different flow charts on how the play button behaves in different states that would make any engineer kind of like the second guess any other application in the world. Like, oh, then how does even like Slack messages work nowadays? Because I thought it was just making a post request.
Right. You thought working on a nuclear reactor was hard. Try the play button in Spotify.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's such a great one though, because you brought up like immediately, well, there are a lot of legal things that we have to figure out. There's so many other things that impact the performance of whatever you're building. I mean, one of the first ones that comes up, and we talked about it, slicing data, is there are users all over the place. Everybody has a different experience, different devices, connections. My power goes out. I don't have fast fiber anymore. But like, there's also legal aspect. What are other things? And maybe there are some other surprises we could talk about, but are there other areas that you find, these are actually really important impacts and factors on performance?
There are, there are always also like business requirements that you have to take care of and whatnot. But when it comes to impacting performance, it's kind of an eternal tug of war on how much you ship. That really matters versus how much you have to ship because of, business logic or things that you want to upsell from that point and whatnot. So it's a kind of an eternal tug of war onto how, because in theory, you always want to send the least amount of code down on the pipe. But there is always the thing where you need to make sure to send to baking more and more features because you know how you want to make the users happy and keep shipping new things. And that's where like performance work becomes really important. So to understanding, okay, what is the minimal the smallest subset of features and code that I can package it up and serve at that one point. And then from that moment onwards, you will like lazy load, prefetch, and like all of those buzzwords, right? Like lazy load, prefetch, preconnect, and eager fetch some things, and have like bump up the fetch priority on certain things like LCP images.
So you don't just load the whole application right out the gate.
No. So to this day, I still remember back in Klarna where I actually ended up creating an internal talk about it, just because I was kind of stupefied on the results. But how code splitting is definitely not a exact science.
Mm-hmm.
So like you can have too much code splitting, you can have too little, and you can have everything in between. And then you also have to understand what parts of your application goes to down the pipe at what times. And, because performance, again, right? Your entire JavaScript is single threaded.
Mm-hmm. So
you want to make sure that you ship the smallest subset of things first, but also make sure that they fully, pass and render, and the application is fully functional and responding to input within a few seconds. And from that moment onwards, you want to make sure that you prefetch and let's say warm up as much of your application beforehand as you can. And there are different strategies for all of that. And
Can you walk me through that? Because you gave a talk on this, yeah?
Yes. So, the whole process came to be because I was moving to another team where we were doing a greenfield project to create a shipping feature set that was going to be part of the checkout experience for some merchants that would choose to have Klarna as the shipping and tracking end of their products.
Mm-hmm.
So for that, again, we were kind of like a vendor within a vendor, because we were a module for the checkout, right? And again, we wanted to make sure that we shipped the least amount of code, because if the user never clicks the shipping button, it would never show, right? So we don't want to include everything into the bundle, and don't want to include all that stuff. We want to include the smallest amount of code that will enable that button to function as fast as possible. And from there, we can load the full experience. So I did the whole code splitting first, right? So I splitted everything. So I chunked everything and like async import a lot of stuff, and created a whole I will chunk things like in a stuff. So like, this is the index. And then from the index, I'll chunk the routes and then whatnot. And it turns out that I was like, in the end, when that first version came out and ran from our pipelines and whatnot, we were worse than just shipping all the bundle.
Really?
Just because of the sheer amount of pressure on the CPU.
Yeah.
Onto having to like download and pass
everything.
And
separately.
download and pass and download and pass. Exactly. So even with HTTP 2.
Yeah. Did you find this out with, did you have like a RUM dashboard or something that alerted you all? Or was it your lab test that caught it?
No,
initially?
that was lab.
Yeah.
Yeah, lab test caught it, because we started seeing that our the early painting and like the first contentful paint and our TTI, which now is being deprecated as a metric, but back then it was one of the points that we could point to, was getting worse. Especially TTI was getting a lot worse. And the thing is that's why code splitting is not exact science, because especially when you think about mobile users on a 3G connection, HTTPS handshake alone can take up to 300 milliseconds.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a lot of overhead, right? So if you ship a lot of chunks, you're talking about a lot of overhead building that HTTPS connection. If of course can be mitigated with HTTP 2 and whatnot, but still, right? You're talking about downloading different chunks and passing different chunks on a very memory and CPU limited device.
It sounds almost like trying to focus on a task. Like instead of just doing everything all in one go, you kept interrupting me every 5 minutes and I couldn't focus, and I spent more energy trying to make it happen.
So the CPU takes a lot longer to actually be free and available. After doing that, I understood that I would have to create different priorities for different chunks, right? So I would have my app shell, which like back then there was the beginning of the whole app shell concept. So I would have the app shell with the absolutely smallest amount of code down on the pipe in like inline CSS and like everything that I could do to just ship the most static version of that thing that would just basically have, like event handlers. And
we're going to show that button
from
and
that,
have it right there.
we want to show that button, the button will be functional within as few seconds as possible. And from that point, the main bundle would then have a subset of chunks with priorities, where we knew that if the user click on a button, we would want to render a certain screen, a certain part of the flow. So that would naturally become our highest priority chunk to prefetch.
Gotcha.
And from that point, any other chunk would be lazy fetched. So they would only have to be downloaded if that we would have to find ourselves into that part of the flow. So then that's where you start thinking about your transitions and load screens and like how do you transition from one state to another. But yeah, like that became a whole experiment on fine-tuning and finding the balance on how much I send versus how much I have to. I can wait and send lazily down on the pipe.
Interesting. And it sounds too like when you're lazily loading things, you're doing like kind of a dance here. I'm going to wait and see if the user clicks the button. If they click the button, then I can start to load the next thing. I'm going to hold until I see the next move. Like, is that you're starting to orchestrate some events that happen before you load the next thing?
Yeah, you start orchestrating the events that happen based on your user flows, right? So if you're talking about a full scale application, then you have, of course, different kinds of way of treating this kind of stuff, like per route and like whatnot, right? Like, and even within the route, you have the different sections of your application that can be loaded on different strategies. But when it comes to that application that we were building back then, it became about our user flow, right? The user flow and the user journey. So whenever the button's fully loaded and ready, then the next page would be eagerly prefetched. And then from that next page, the moment that next page hits, the next page would try to prefetch the next step. And like some parts of the next step that are like, because you always have like business logic and conditions like, oh, if this happened, that, then like whatever is always the most common flow becomes like an eager fetch, and the rest becomes a lazy fetch, like all that stuff to try to prioritize and mitigate all the overheads around trying to download things too eagerly.
Yeah, man. How do you learn how to do all this stuff? Like, is this all trial and error that you're just, let's figure it out on the job? Or do you have places you're going, people like, how do you learn stuff?
Well, that is a great question. So I'm very lucky to have worked with very clever people around me that would help me question those things and come to realizations that I now have. And it's a lot of experimentation, a lot of trial and error, a lot of going to to conventions and talking to smarter people than you, exchanging ideas and processes. And yeah, it's like really not being afraid to fail and not being afraid to look at the data and understand what's happening also. So like, why did I fail now? Why is it slower? And really get to the bottom of it, of why is it slower? Really, why is it? And understand what different factors might incur. And yeah, from that is like trying different things, see what sticks.
Are there any particular resources that you'd recommend for people if they were trying to learn web performance now or getting in for the first time?
Definitely, there is a lot of the Google developer videos out there on that they deal with the developer tooling. Even the other Google developer videos, like understanding the flame graph and understanding the profiler and all that stuff, definitely helps to understand some of the things, like videos about like I had Lighthouse also from them, and like a lot of talks that you can look around for like cover people like Paul Irish and Paul Lewis and, you know, like all those trailblazers that brought us where we currently are on tooling. Definitely helps as well.
Nice. All right. 2 places I think we could go next, and then we can wrap it up. On the one hand, I feel like there's a lot of parallels and overlaps between performance and other aspects, you know, even security and accessibility. And then on the other hand, hey, if you went back, you know, to 2012, what would you tell yourself from a decade ago? So here's my 2, comparing performance and other aspects, and what would you tell yourself 10 years ago?
Right. So when it comes to comparing performance to the different aspects, I would say it boils down to user experience. They kind of are different facets of the same thing. So it's like a dice, right? It has different sides, but the sum of the whole deals with user experience, right? So how reliable is your user experience? How in all different fronts, really. Like, is it gonna reliably load fast to me? Is it gonna reliably work without problems? Is it gonna give me good user experience if I am a person with a screen reader? And all of that matters, and all of that is about the user experience. So it really boils down to that. That's why I'm like, where it all started for me, back in all those years back then, where I really was keen on to understanding user experience as much as I could, and it kind of naturally evolved into performance, because it kind of is part of user experience as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to the other question, I think if I would be able to meet my younger self, I would definitely tell them to just, take your time understanding things, the basics first, as always. Because I actually had the opportunity and pleasure to mentor a bit myself.
Yeah.
I mentored my brother. He was on a law career that shifted to development.
Wow.
And I mentored him alongside of his whole university course and all. And it is the advice I gave him, and I would give my younger self the same, where the basics, the fundamentals matter a lot. And it's where you build the whole knowledge on top of.
Fantastic. Vinicius, really appreciate you taking the time. It's been a great time talking.
Yeah, it was awesome.
I hope we get to do this again.
Absolutely. Yeah, hit me up.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on the show. And until next time.
Yeah, take care.